The Cold War was fought, or not fought, between 1945 to 1991 between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's called the Cold War because, well, bullets are hot and there were a lot of cold feelings. You need to understand the difference between the two nations. The United States was a democracy and had capitalism as its economic system. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, they supported both socialism economically and a dictatorship politically. The two equaled communism. The United States wanted to contain communism, whereas the Soviet Union wanted to spread it. The United States wanted to reopen Eastern European markets for trade, whereas the Soviet Union wanted to keep that area divided, as well as keep Germany divided. The United States wanted to reunite Germany. The whole crux of the Cold War centers around George Kennan's idea of containment. Containment means to stop the spread of communism. This can be done by forming alliances with smaller countries who are more susceptible to having communism take over their nation. In the early years of the Cold War, President Truman fostered the Truman Doctrine. That meant that the United States would give military aid to any nation that wanted to resist communism. Both Greece and Turkey took advantage of the Truman Doctrine. As for the Marshall Plan, George Marshall wanted to give a lot of money to nations that were resisting communism, and $12.5 billion were given to nations to strengthen them and to prevent a communist takeover. The biggest challenge in the early years of the Cold War took place in Berlin. West Berlin was controlled by the Allies, whereas East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin blockaded West Berlin so that food could not be brought in. The United States could have just given in to Stalin at that time, but instead they responded with the Berlin Airlift. This is when 277,000 flights dropped food and aid to the people of Berlin. It could have led to World War III, but it did not. This is a great example of containment. Also during this time period, we have alliances such as NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They went against the Warsaw Pact. That was with nations that favored communism and the Soviet Union. The dividing line between NATO and the Warsaw Pact was called the Iron Curtain. That term was coined by Britain's Winston Churchill to show that we weren't quite sure what Joseph Stalin was doing behind that Iron Curtain, but we're sure that it was something against the United States and its allies. There were a lot of things in the sky that triggered a lot of conflict during the Cold War. For example, in 1957, the Soviet Union shot up Sputnik, which was a satellite. This made the United States feel insecure about their space program, and it led to a lot of funding for education, the creation of NASA, and eventually the space race that ends with the United States landing on the moon in 1969. Also in the sky in 1960 was the U-2 spy plane. This was an incident that occurred when the United States had a spy plane crash behind enemy lines in the Soviet Union. This showed distrust on both sides. In addition, nuclear bombs could have been in the air. Luckily, they weren't. The largest arms race that ever took place was during the Cold War, and that was because there was a new bomb, an H-bomb, a hydrogen bomb, which was 1,000 times more powerful than an atomic bomb that was used in World War II. Around the same time in the 1950s, there was conflict on the home front in the United States. This was because Senator Joseph McCarthy went on a witch hunt to try to find who the communists were in government. There was also the House Un-American Activities Committee that looked to arrest suspected communists. Two people who were arrested and executed were the Rosenbergs. They were accused and convicted of selling nuclear secrets to the Soviets. The U.S. Supreme Court got involved in the case of Dennis versus the U.S. They ruled that when you were plotting against the U.S. government, it would limit your free speech. This was certainly a limitation of the First Amendment. The Cold War was certainly a time of brinkmanship. That means going to the brink but not having a war. The height of the Cold War brinkmanship took place in 1962. That was when John F. Kennedy was president. Kennedy, whose New Frontier looked to inspire Americans, he favored the Peace Corps as well as the Alliance for Progress. Both organizations brought aid to nations in Africa as well as Latin America. The goal here, just like it was in Europe, was to make sure that nations could get stronger so they would not be taken over by the communists. Though president for a short amount of time, JFK saw a lot of conflict. In 1961, Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, put up the Berlin Wall. That divided East Berlin and West Berlin until 1989. He wanted to stop people from moving from East Berlin into West Berlin. It would be here in 1987 that President Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, tear down this wall." But the closest that the two nations ever came to World War III, that centered around Cuba. When Fidel Castro brought communism to Cuba, it concerned America because now communism was only 90 miles away from the United States border. It was in the interest of Kennedy to remove Castro from power. However, that failed. You have in 1961 the Bay of Pigs invasion, where a bunch of armed Cuban refugees failed to even get a defensive position on the beach. They were quickly captured. Soon enough, missiles from Moscow arrived at Cuba. They were stationed all around and aimed at the United States. United States surveillance saw these, and JFK had a major problem. For 13 days, people thought that World War III was upon them. However, Kennedy went on TV and had a solution. He said that the United States would quarantine all military shipments from the Soviet Union to Cuba. Furthermore, he threatened a mainland invasion of Cuba. In the end, there was peace because the United States agreed to move some missiles out of Turkey, and therefore Khrushchev said that he would take his missiles out of Cuba. Crisis averted, for now. As the United States remained vigilant about what could happen in Latin America, President Nixon took over. He wanted Détente, which was a loosening of Cold War tensions. Détente could be seen in the SALT Treaty. That is the strategic arms limitation talks that took place in the 1970s. Both nations agreed to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that they had. In addition, Nixon supported ping-pong diplomacy. That's when ping-pong players went to China and tried to make friends with that large communist nation. By the 1980s, the United States was back to spending a lot of money on defense. President Ronald Reagan supported Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. This was an expensive and complicated way to shoot missiles out of the sky. The Soviet Union would slowly collapse on its own, as glasnost or openness was brought to the Soviet Union, as well as perestroika, which was an economic restructuring. After the failed August coup in 1991, the Cold War was over.